Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, heads of government and heads of delegations, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to extend the usual warm greetings from the government and people of Grenada, on whose behalf I am privileged to address this noble institution and its distinguished members. Mr. President, I'm also pleased to join esteemed colleagues before me in thanking the outgoing President of the 70th session of the General Assembly, His Excellency Margans Likatov of Denmark, for his energetic and focused leadership. I commend, Mr. President, the 70th session of the GA for so diligently charting the course towards transforming our world through the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Mr. President, indeed, I must congratulate and thank Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for his extraordinary leadership of the United Nations, and to express our deep gratitude, especially for the keen interest he has shown in the development challenges facing small island developing states. To the incoming President of the 71st session of the General Assembly, Ambassador Peter Thompson of Fiji, please be assured of my delegation's fullest cooperation and support as you spearhead cooperation on this session's theme, the Sustainable Development Goals, a universal push to transform our world. Mr. President, allow me to use this podium to recognize the contribution of a gigantic Grenadian personality who passed away this week, His Excellency Sir Lionel Stanislaus, who served Grenada, the region, and this institution with distinction and honor for over a decade as Grenada's permanent representative to the United Nations and 1 year as Vice President of the General Assembly. Mr. President, Sir Lionel was the embodiment of diplomacy and statesmanship. His contributions transcended nationality, geography, and subject matter. He was an eloquent and convincing voice in this chamber, addressing issues on behalf of his country, his region. May his soul rest in peace. But Mr. President, I believe it is very ironic that this very noble gentleman buried today, the same day on which Grenada addresses this very important institution. Mr. President, Grenada recommits unwaveringly so to the United Nations and its principles as outlined in the Charter. Our commitment to the norms of peace, equality, justice, to human rights and multilateralism is clear, Mr. President. At home, Grenada continues to embrace opportunities to consolidate democratic values and practices in civil life. I am proud to inform this noble body that on October 27th of this year, 2016, Grenadians' voices will be heard on the matter of broad constitution reform. Mr. President, may I say that I hail from a very tiny island of Carriacou, which together with Petite Martinique form my constituency and part of the mainland Grenada, and makes up, Mr. President, the tri-island state. Mr. President, one of the possible outcomes of the upcoming referendum could be a change in the name of the state so as to better represent the collective identity of our nation. Mr. President, the reforms also include amendments to the Bill of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, which would guarantee access to public education to every Grenadian child up to 16 years of age, and would further ensure that children with disabilities are afforded public education tailored to their specific needs up to the age of 18. Mr. President, Grenada is committed to Sustainable Development Goal 5, which speaks to gender equality and discrimination against women and girls. In this regard, Mr. President, the reforms also call on the state to ensure that men and women are entitled to equal rights and status in all spheres of life, especially in economic, educational, political, civil, and social activities, that women not be discriminated against by reason of marital status, pregnancy, or any gender-based attribute, and that Parliament may enact laws suitable to correct disparities and inequities between men and women. Mr. President, we live in a world that is plagued with many challenges: civil wars, famine, drought, floods, impact of climate change, humanitarian and economic crises, and terrorism. But we also built this United Nations, Mr. President, for the express purpose of addressing these challenges. The United Nations was built to steer us away from anarchy and perpetual antagonism. With the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we have created a new pathway to achieve a more equitable and lasting brand of development. This pathway, Mr. President, is paved with clean energy, universal access to education, affordable health care, food security, clean water and air, and gender and racial equality. Mr. President, history has shown that development is tenuous wherever human rights and the environment are not prioritized. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals are a product of deep reflection and learning, and the realization that development without human rights and environmental consideration is unreliable, Mr. President. Despite the remarkable progress made on each of the Millennium Development Goals, the fact that at least $2.5 trillion will be needed each year for the SDGs signals the size of the gap that remains to be addressed, Mr. President. Mr. President, Grenada is resolute in its commitment to conserve and promote the sustainable use of the oceans, seas, and marine resources, SDG Goal 14. Earlier this year, Mr. President, Grenada hosted Blue Week 2016. This conference was held in collaboration and partnership with the government of the Netherlands, Indonesia, the FAO, the World Bank, the Global Ocean Forum, the Clinton Climate Initiative, the Caribbean Challenge Initiative, and the Nature Conservancy. At this event, Mr. President, we employed the innovative and popularized Shark Tank approach, which allow local and international owner entrepreneurs to pitch projects for funding. The rationale being that we cannot continue to only talk of the problems at ocean conferences. We need to facilitate solutions and commitments for the sustainable development and use of our oceans. Mr. President, ocean economy is important, a very important starting point to thinking about conservation. The natural capital of the ocean is like the principal deposit on an interest-bearing account. Unfortunately, Mr. President, instead of living off the interest, we have been drawing down from the principal. Mr. President, the work done by WWF and the Boston Consulting Group on the ocean economy tells of the US 24 trillion asset value of the oceans, which generates some 2.5 trillion per year. Mr. President, the need to preserve this natural capital is self-evident. But when we consider data provided by the World Bank and FAO, we see that the world is losing 83 billion per year from unsustainable fishing practices, Mr. President. Mr. President, 9 Caribbean nations have committed to conserving and managing 20% of its marine and coastal environment by 2020. Mr. President, I'm very pleased to say that Grenada has committed to conserve 25% of its coastal area and marine resources by 2020. Both of these commitments are well above the target 5 of the SDG goal number 14, which calls for 10% conservation by 2020. Mr. President, small island nations in the Caribbean and the Pacific must be lead advocates on oceans and climate change. Most of us have more space in our sea than we do on land. Grenada, for instance, Grenada's marine territory is 75 times its land mass. The ratios are even higher for other archipelagos. But Mr. President, this is why Grenada is pleased to play a leading role not only in the Blue Network, but also in the Blue Guardians facilitated by the Clinton Foundation and the GLISPA initiatives for islands. We invite other countries to partner with us and participate in both occasions. Mr. President, Grenada is also helping the Blue Network create an online database and platform for ocean-related projects seeking funding. This initiative, called BlueNet, will be showcased at Ocean Day during COP22 in Marrakesh. Mr. President, financing, and together with our small size, severely affects our ability to invest in renewable energy projects. Today, Grenada calls on member states, especially the ones who possess the technology and the technical capacity, to continue work with small island developing states to increase their ability to harness existing renewable energy opportunities. Mr. President, Grenada is almost 100% reliant on imported fossil fuels for electricity generation. As a result, our development is held hostage to the global price fluctuations and the high cost of electricity generation. We, Mr. President, therefore call for easier access to the Green Climate Fund to support renewable energy projects in SIDS. Mr. President, in this regard, Grenada calls for a commitment from world leaders to deposit the instruments of ratification to the Paris Agreement on climate change by the end of 2016. We hope that the 22nd session of the Conference of the Parties that will be held in Marrakesh, Morocco in November will build on the gains of the COP21 and garner momentum that will propel the full implementation of the Paris Agreement. Mr. President, Grenada further calls upon the international community to work with Grenada and other small island developing states on the innovative approaches to international climate financing, which would include catalyzing private investment. Mr. President, we suffer from debt overhang that limits fiscal space to address the climate change. While the IMF has consistently expressed satisfaction in Grenada's response to addressing the structural deficiency that are both a symptom and a cause of this overhang, this response has, however, come at a huge sacrifice for our citizens, who are already sufficiently suffer from climate change, fossil fuel dependence on the financial crises. These three problems, Mr. President, one and another and collectively limit our ability to invest in the climate action that can actually alleviate all three issues, creating a vicious cycle. Working with partners, Grenada will optimize various leadership platforms to create practical, concrete initiatives to turn this vicious cycle into a virtuous one, where climate action can catalyze a wave of public and private investment that alleviates all three problems. Such measures, Mr. President, would help small states like Grenada, Carriacou, and Petermanic to implement action on climate in areas such as potable water, renewable energy, and energy efficiency, climate-smart agriculture, climate resilient home and buildings, and resilient coasts and oceans, to name a few. These are the developments that our people are demanding, not for tomorrow, Mr. President, but for today. Mr. President, when we observe the climate changes in our world today and the effects on humanity, we owe it to ourselves and our succeeding generation to act with immediacy, and we must act now, Mr. President. And Mr. President, as we attempt to transform our world, we are confronted with certain global financial policies and actions that pose significant threats to our region's sustainable development. Mr. President, correspondent banking and delinking, blacklisting, and the issue of middle income status graduation are measures that negatively affect Caribbean economies. Mr. President, the unilateral and premature graduation of many small island developing states to middle income status without consideration of our region's specific vulnerabilities has resulted in significant budgetary shortfalls, adversely affecting our economic and social development. Mr. President, our region has inherent structural economic challenges that already restrict the pace of our development. We ask that these impediments to growth be considered when our matters arise for consideration, Mr. President. Indeed, the current formula that is used generalizes where generalization should not be made. Outside of GDP per capita, the within group differences among the so-called middle-income countries is astounding, Mr. President. Economists are today admitting that inequality has not been treated with any depth until very recently. Economists also readily admit that GDP is an imperfect measure of development. Mr. President, the withdrawal of correspondent banking services to CARICOM member states can be seen as an economic assault that would destabilize the financial sector of our already vulnerable economies, Mr. President. Mr. President, for small economies like ours, the impact could be enormous. Just to use one example, the World Bank has indicated that more than 90% of remittances are transferred through correspondent banking services. Mr. President, remittances contribute in real and significant terms to the GDP of small nation states. The World Bank goes on to state that a sudden stop of remittances in economies that rely on these flows could pose a significant threat to the socio-economic stability in that region. Mr. President, Grenada applauds the progress made in the recent rapprochement between Cuba and the United States. Grenada sees this peaceful resolution through dialogue as an example to be emulated between and among all states where violence, conflicts, and dispute prevail. Mr. President, Grenada reiterates that it neither promulgates, applies, nor condones laws or measures that encroach on or undermine the sovereignty or the sovereign rights of any state. Neither laws that restrict or hinder international trade or navigation by any state, and consequently issue another clarion call for the total lifting of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on the government and the people of Cuba by the United States of America. Mr. President, as we forge ahead, it is important to bear in mind that poverty is multi-dimensional in nature, and its implications for youth and women go beyond concepts of income or consumption. Our youth experiences are not only driven by lack of employment or poor working conditions, but must include access to health services and decent opportunities. We must ensure that we build the necessary skills and knowledge to undertake economic activities with an emphasis on vocational training, entrepreneurship, skills, and innovation for young people, Mr. President. Mr. President, we recognize the importance of regional cooperation and international partnership to address the scourge of non-communicable diseases. Our aim is to take a holistic approach, utilizing the United Nations system, WHO and PAHO, to ground the agenda and guide us forward, Mr. President. Mr. President, the key role is to assist us to address our capacity constraints and in facilitating knowledge sharing, allowing the use of innovative approaches that could be adapted to our country's needs. Mr. President, President Obama, in his address to us a few days ago, reiterated that the health issues that we currently face respects no walls, no boundaries. Let us therefore pool our collective energies and resources to build capacity to rid humanity of these scourges. Mr. President, Grenada continues its clarion call for a negotiated two-state settlement between Israel and Palestine. Grenada, Mr. President, whatever the road taken, the end result must be potentiate the full self-determination of the Palestinian people in economic, social, political, and religious terms. Grenada recognizes the struggle of the Palestinian people and beseeches the international community to reject political pragmatism and the status quo while generations are being lost. Mr. President, the United Nations membership must make Article 1, Sub 3 of the Charter a major priority in the next few years. Our founding fathers, Mr. President, called for this body to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction to race, sex, language, or religion. Mr. President, we must do all in our power to provide added economic opportunities for the developing world. I therefore call on the Economic and Social Council to actively pursue undertakings that could create an encouraging atmosphere for member states to have the opportunity to raise the standard of living of the people. In this current global environment, Mr. President, we must be conscious that inclusion in the process of global economy is vital. Finally, Mr. President, I must recall Article 1, Sub 1 of the United Nations Charter, which calls for the organization to maintain international peace, security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to peace. We must be relentless in our pursuit of the purposes of this organization. Our challenge is to work towards the elimination of terrorism and terrorist activities and armed conflicts around the world. Our quest, Mr. President, must be for economic opportunities for all states, and our goal should be for the peaceful coexistence of all peoples, the international community. Indeed, Mr. President, if we can achieve these, we will be well on our way to transforming our world. Thank you very much, Mr. President.